My husband's best friend from childhood was the best man at our wedding. And when he came for our wedding, they started swapping stories, as people who have grown up will. They involved a lot of riding bikes down hills and, escaping parents and swimming in lakes and a lot of Star Wars, as children of the 70s usually do. And actually, the night before our wedding, one of the new Star Wars movies came out, and they all went to see it instead of having a bachelor party. They grew up as kids in the 70s, and it was a good time, and there were Star Wars involved, and they stayed in touch through our wedding, and then after our wedding, they kept in touch by email, and Jason, my husband's best friend, became a simultaneous translator. And so he worked for all these companies, and he moved to Tokyo, Japan, because he is a Japanese simultaneous translator. And he met a woman and got married. My husband did the wedding. And at Christmas, through the miracle of Skype, that video chat, Jetsons type of thing, through that, and I truly mean it's a miracle, because halfway around the world we could see Jason. We met their baby boy, who was born right before Christmas. His name is Kane Yanigasawa Andres. I practiced that, made sure I got it right. Sweet baby boy. And so, like some of you maybe, we woke up to the news that there was a earthquake of great magnitude right near Tokyo. And this wave that was going as fast as a jumbo jet. And our first response, of course, were, are they okay? And we didn't know for a while if they were okay. And finally, we did find out that they were okay. By another miracle, I would say, they had moved just a little while before, when the baby was born, into an earthquake-proof building that was a couple stories above the ground, and they were away a little bit from where the bad part was. So we talked to them, and they're okay, but so many people weren't. And we thought how easy it would be to never hear from them again. There are 4 trains missing, just whole trains. This is really amazing in the worst possible way to hear about this, to wake up and to know that we had people that we cared about in this place. And so, our first impulse is anybody that I cared about there, and our second one is how can I help? And our third one, I think, is who can we blame? In tragedies that happen almost always, we think it's one of our impulses to say, whose fault is it? And here it's an earthquake in the middle of the ocean, but I have to say, I don't watch much news, but when I watch the news, people are trying to talk about who we could blame this on, and I thought, really? It's an earthquake. Maybe people are blaming God. I'm assuming that they are, but to blame someone else for these things that happen, it just seems unimaginable, and yet there it is. And when tragedies happen that are human-made, then we blame everybody. I think I've said before, I worked in Colorado near Columbine right after the school shootings happened. And you want to talk about blame, there wasn't somebody who wasn't blamed. The people, the parents, video games, Colorado itself, it was really amazing to live there and hear just all the blame that was thrown around for these 2 guys who were very disturbed. Who committed this act. So I think that's kind of what we do. It's some of the things we do anyway. And it's not new. It's as old as the story of Genesis itself. What we do, how humans function when bad things happen, when we make all these choices. My kids say, when they heard the story of Genesis and heard about Adam and Eve in the garden, and they heard about this talking snake that came up to Eve and had some things to say, they said, "Mom, did that story really happen?" Well, seminary didn't really prepare me for that. There's all these theories and all kinds of other stuff, but it doesn't prepare you for when your child says, "Did the story really happen?" So I'll tell you what I told them, because this is the best I can do. I don't know if it really happened like that, the Adam and Eve story. I don't know. But I know that it's true. I know that there's truth in this story about humans and about God and about the relationships that we have with each other and the blame that we put on things, even if it's a talking snake, like in this story. We try to blame something. I know that there's truth in this story, even if it didn't necessarily happen exactly that way. We, as Lutherans, we have that freedom to say that. We know that it's true, that it's a true story about God and God's people. I don't know if my kids bought it, but that's the best I can do. That's what I think about this Adam and Eve story, and it's an old story. It goes back to 2200 BC. That's the first time that maybe something about Adam and Eve was written down. And did you know there's stories of Adam and Eve in the garden and the snake in lots of other cultures? Cultures around the world and cultures kind of around the same time. This story started springing up. It's in the Quran, the Muslim book of holy text, the story of Adam and Eve, and the garden, and the snake, and the piece of fruit. This is a true story. Whether or not it happened, I think all of us recognize that this story is a story that is true, that happened, that still happens. This story of blaming and Adam and Eve and the snake and all these kinds of things. And I think so many people wanted to tell some version of this Adam and Eve story because it's pretty obvious that just after the creation of the world, humanity went ahead and decided that they were pretty much going to do whatever they wanted after the creation, even if he or she knew that it was wrong. So the garden. Usually we think about this garden. I mean, it's the Garden of Eden, right? It's supposed to be perfect, and nothing is ever wrong, and it's Shangri-La, it's heaven. But if you look at it, it wasn't perfect. It was just good. God created the world and pronounced everything good. And Adam wasn't on a hammock in some vacation, as sometimes I think I've pictured him. He's on a hammock somewhere, he's just picking fruit, and Eve is picking the fruit, and they're just relaxing, and everything is great. But if you look at it, God already had put them to work. This was not some vacation in a garden where everything was perfect. Adam had to work for a living, and he had to tend all those animals and name all those animals and kind of corral them all. And as any farmer will tell you, that's more than a full-time job. Adam was doing all these things as his job, and Eve too. And so they're working in the garden, and things aren't perfect, but they're good. They're good as God had pronounced them. It wasn't a vacation. God was pretty clear that they were going to be working. And it was very good. Chaos had existed from the very beginning, God says. In the beginning of the world, the first thing that God did was to take that chaos and push it back. It says that God separated the waters from the land, pushed back that chaos, and no wonder, because when I saw the pictures of the water rushing over the land, and if you remember the tsunami in Indonesia, it was the same way. When you see that the water rushing over the land, it looks wrong. It looks wrong, I mean, because there's cars swirling in it and all kinds of other things, but it looks so frightening and it looks so wrong that no wonder the first thing that God did in the beginning of creation was to push that back, was to separate the land from the water. And even the ancient people knew when your land flooded, as it did, you knew it was going to happen, but it was bad. You knew you had to get out of the way. You knew that was a little bit of chaos coming into your good world, to your good farm, the life that you were trying to make for yourself. And so it still is like that. When that chaos comes into the world, God is still trying to push it back, to organize the chaos. But the chaos was still there, out on the edges. The chaos, I think, was still in the garden and still in the serpent that God had made. Did y'all notice that? God made the serpent. God made the serpent. I hadn't ever noticed that before, I don't think. God made this serpent that was in the garden, and it wasn't the devil. The devil comes later with Jesus, I think, but this serpent isn't the devil. He's just a little crafty. He's just a little wise. He just has a couple questions about what is going on in that garden and what is with that tree that's in the middle, and trying to ask Eve, what is going on with that? And they both lie, the serpent and Eve. So you know that there was chaos there, because it wasn't like sin entered in with the bite of the apple, because Eve was lying before she took the bite. Eve was already starting to say, well, no, God said we shouldn't even touch the tree, which, if you look back, isn't really true. And the serpent was trying to put that forward by saying, is it true that you can't eat out of any of these trees? And Eve says, no, there's just the one, but we can't touch it. Or God said that we were going to die. And then the serpent says, well, no, you won't surely die. All of these lies that are going around from Eve and the serpent are before she's even taken a bite of the fruit. Before she's even taken that I guess sometimes we think of it as the fatal bite. There's still chaos. There's still things going on that God is trying to push back. And I think even when God gave them that instruction about don't eat out of this tree, eat out of any of the trees, just not this one. I think when God gave them that instruction, God was already trying to push that chaos out of the garden, to push that out of God's good creation. We don't know why they weren't supposed to eat off the tree. Maybe it wasn't ripe yet. Maybe it was one of those trees that were poison for humans but okay for deer. Maybe God made it for somebody else, and God knew when they disobeyed that they would know that they were capable of doing that evil. I don't think it was about the apple, and I don't think it was about the snake. I think it was about the choice that Eve made. The choice to walk out of God's will, to walk out of her will, because it looked okay. Those are the lies we tell ourselves sometimes. It looks okay. You would think maybe it's all right. I'd like to be wise. In Proverbs, God is going to tell everybody wisdom is great. We should all aspire to be wise, but the timing wasn't right. And Eve didn't trust God, and so she took it and blamed it on a talking snake. The first chance she got, I thought, Eve, maybe a little better story next time than a talking snake to blame it on. But she takes the apple, and she takes a bite. And I think it's about the choice that Eve made. It's about the rebellion. Even if it didn't make any sense, she was choosing to act outside of her will. And the story writers must have known that at some point that happened for the first time, and it keeps on happening. God didn't create us to be puppets, because the greatest joy comes from knowing that you're doing the right thing and making that choice. But what happens after a tragedy? What happens after? I don't mean the blaming part. I don't mean all of those things. I mean people rushing in to help. I wasn't kidding when I said that I've already heard from plenty of you saying, how can I help? How can I help this current tragedy? Sometimes we get tired because things happen all over the world, all these things, and it's fatiguing to see them and know that we can't help with all of them. But some of you were called to help and said, how can I give? How can I help? Already, 2 days later. That's something that's in us, I think, to make that choice, because that's a way that God pushes the chaos back, is through us and through our work and through the work of others. That's one way that God is still about the business of raising up life from death, of separating the chaos from the good creation, of separating the light from the darkness.